Hi, welcome back to Being the Best Version of Yourself podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Carrie Heller. All right, today we have a really fun guest and a great topic. So first, let's introduce our guest. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Great. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Elana Hoffman. I am a clinical psychologist with a virtual private practice in Washington, D.C., and I focus on relationships. So I focus on couples and intimacy. And more recently, actually, I've been focused more on helping people rebuild after life transitions like divorce, which is a time where people really want to understand themselves and everything that happened. And really, it's a time for important introspection. So I talk with a lot of people going through this transition. And I talk with a lot of people about neurodiversity and ADHD and anxiety and how that plays a part in relationships. And so thank you so much for having me.
No, great. Well, we're happy to have you. All right. So today we're going to talk a lot about couples and ADHD. And one of the things that often comes up with that is the role of anxiety or anxious couple and how that impacts things. So tell us a little bit about from your experiences what that looks like and how that tends to impact relationships.
Yeah, so I see a lot of couples with either diagnosed or undiagnosed ADHD and anxiety. So one partner has ADHD and one partner has anxiety. And I often encourage, if I'm working with a couple, that they have their own individual therapist and maybe they seek their own evaluations and diagnoses because so much can be understood through that lens. And so, but they don't come in necessarily understanding that and knowing that, they kind of come in both people thinking that the other person is wrong about something. And this, of course, leads to a lot of conflict. But one of the things I also start with when I see this kind of pairing is also the thing that drew them to each other in the first place, which is a big, which is important to discuss because I think it just contextualizes a lot of things and it's very validating to kind of talk about. And often what I see is, somebody who is, later to be diagnosed, maybe ADHD, is kind of drawn to an anxious person who seems like, they have their stuff together, they're reliable, they're responsible, they're planful, they're thinking ahead. And it kind of hits something in the mind of the person with ADHD of like, wow, it's sort of part of them that they sort of wish that they could have or that they struggle with. And so we're often drawn to people like that who show the parts of ourselves that, maybe we are not aware of, are kind of lacking or we wish would be different. And on the flip side, the anxious person is often drawn to the person with ADHD because they are fun and spontaneous and passionate and intense in a different kind of way. That really kind of complements their sort of anxiety or, so maybe some rigid tendencies and sort of like a breath of fresh air in some ways. Like they really feel like this person is bringing out this part of themselves that they maybe sometimes subconsciously wish were more present and available. So it really makes a lot of sense why these people are kind of drawn to each other initially. And so I often, when I start with any couple, I really talk about kind of their origins and what drew them to each other and, contextualize a lot of the things because sometimes the things that draw someone to someone else in the first place often later become bigger issues.
Well, I mean, that's really fascinating. I think that I don't think I ever thought about it quite in that way. So I think you've, made some really powerful point about how, sort of some of the ADHD may be attracted to someone who's anxious and vice versa. And the idea of, trying to find something, you don't have, in the other person. And
Yeah.
so your point about the idea how that's, may be what attracts you initially to them, the same time creates issues later. Let's talk a little bit about what issues you often see that come up later in a relationship in that kind of dynamic.
Yeah. So often the partner with anxiety, and I will also say that this is often unrecognized anxiety. And it is really thought of as people thinking that their way is the right way to do things. So they sort of state things, in terms of preferences. But often what is underneath that is really anxiety of something not going the way that they would like it to go, or they really are afraid of something different or unknown. And so, they'll kind of just say, well, of course it makes sense that we would do XYZ in this way. Why wouldn't it? Right. And so, like, of course you have to plan ahead for a summer vacation. Of course you have to, shop around for the right hotels and the best deals. And why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't anyone do that? Of course, that's the right thing to do. Right. And someone with ADHD might have a very difficult time researching and planning and keeping an organized spreadsheet of hotel deals. I mean, that is probably not happening, right? That's not happening. And so so they're like, well, this isn't this isn't the right way to do things, but they feel like they are, there's something wrong with them. Like they're sort of made to feel like there's something wrong with them if they're not thinking about it in this certain way, approaching it the way that the person with anxiety would approach it. But the person with anxiety is very nervous about missing out on something, spending more money than is necessary, missing what they want to do. And that is anxiety, often masked as just a preference. So a lot of the work is really understanding and like removing shame around all of it, around anxiety, around ADHD, and just sort of recognizing this is how you are wired. This is why, talking, of course, family of origin, heritable traits. I mean, all of this stuff. But once people start to recognize, their own anxiety and their own ADHD, it can be really transformative. But oftentimes I actually find that the person who's anxious has a harder time recognizing their anxiety, because we also live in this society that values this kind of thing, this sort of type A approach. So people say, I'm type A, my partner's not type A. Often type A has a lot of anxiety. And so that is a big piece of it. So, you can see how in the beginning it's kind of like, oh, we're drawn to each other. But as life gets more complicated, which it does if you are together in a relationship moving forward and you have to plan things and you plan your life and you have kids and you have all these things going on, spontaneity is not always, is the person with anxiety will say, well, you can't be spontaneous, and then the person with ADHD will say, you're not fun, you're rigid, you're controlling, right? It's often controlling. They perceive it to be controlling when really it's anxiety. And that's also the importance of understanding that it's anxiety and the intention is not to control. And so that's the dynamic that I see a lot.
Do you feel like in a lot of situations, the person who's more anxious or the one without ADHD often becomes sort of the caretaker in a lot of ways as a result of either feeling the other person with ADHD either can't get stuff done or isn't doing it in a way that they perceive to be sort of a good way of doing it? Like, because I think it seemed like you sort of alluded to that a little in terms of that. But maybe you could talk a little more about that piece of it, of kind of the caretaker role and how that sort of impacts things in the relationship.
Yeah, for sure. This definitely has the possibility to become more of a parent-child dynamic where the anxious person feels like, again, doesn't actually have to, but feels like they have to take care of all of these things, or it doesn't get done, or it doesn't get done in the way that they would like it to get done. And then the ADHD person feels like they're being parented, right? They're being told what to do. They're being controlled. They're being told that they're wrong if they're doing things a certain way. They're being reminded several times. And this is a dynamic that neither person wants, neither adult wants in that relationship. It doesn't feel like a partnership. It doesn't feel like you're a team. It's definitely not a sexy dynamic. And so that affects intimacy and all kinds of things that sort of can show up as a result of this pairing sometimes if you don't, kind of think about it in this way and take steps to address it. But definitely the parent-child dynamic, for sure, I see a lot of. Yeah.
And I mean, I guess when a couple is really not on the same page with things, or like the day-to-day interactions cause a lot of friction, what's often a good starting point to try to make things better?
Yeah, I mean, I think a good starting point is really talking about, the origin and validating the things that they used to see as positives in each other and trying to reframe their own perspectives about that and really trying to understand each other and acknowledge the strengths that they both bring to life and to the relationship. And as parents, oftentimes people come to couples therapy too late for that, right? There's a lot of resentment, a lot of anger, a lot of hurt and disappointment. And there is a point where this kind of conversation isn't helpful. It's just, there's just too much hurt. There's too much disappointment. There's too much tension. It's just, you are not coming from a place of wanting to understand your partner. And that really has to happen in order to make change and change dynamics. You have to feel compassion and like desire to want things to be different in order, but like to be compassionate to your partner in order for that to happen. And oftentimes people come too late. So, but if you don't come too late and you are in that space, then there can be really transformative, because people are generally, if they are in a place of before all the resentment builds and it's too late, of like a generous perspective taking, right? They can really learn to do that, and they can do their own research and they can really understand these things. And if you yourself as an individual are open-minded and you are open to hearing, hey, maybe you have ADHD, maybe you have anxiety, like, let's talk about this. This is not a bad thing. This is not a shameful thing. This is just how you are. So let's discuss it. If they are open-minded themselves, that is huge. I mean, that's huge. You have to be. in order to sort of change things up. So, I mean, those are really important prerequisites for changing the dynamic in a relationship. But sometimes people are really too stuck and feel too bad about themselves, because the other thing that comes up with this dynamic is, yeah, the person with ADHD just starts to feel like they're doing everything wrong. They can't do anything right. They're judged all the time. And then they just don't do anything. And then they just actually don't do it. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Then the anxious person is the one that is like, well, I do everything. And then that becomes truth. So, I mean, you have to understand, but you have to be willing to change the behavior, right? So it is true that the person kind of with ADHD who's been maybe not stepping up as much, like, needs to take a bit of a risk. And there's also anxiety in that too, because people are anxious about being told that they're doing something wrong. So they often won't, won't kind of step up. And so they have to. And then the anxious person also has to like let things go, not comment, not criticize, not judge, and understand that critiques of how someone's doing something is criticism. And so they'll say that it's not, but it is. And especially over time, it can really erode the esteem and the confidence.
Yeah, no, those are definitely really important points. If we think about this idea of, sort of being told you're not doing something right, or, a difference of opinion on how to do something. I don't know, sort of, with your couples work, do you find that the issue of how to load the dishwasher comes up a lot? Because
Yeah.
I think this seems to be sort of a common thing I've noticed over the years that, people have different perspectives on how to do it and how to approach it. And it sort of seems like sometimes you can probably, I imagine, learn a lot about dynamics of a couple from, if there's a battle over the dishwasher.
Yes, the battle of the dishwasher. This is quite literal. Yes, yes. Yes, this comes up all the time. The thing about the battle of the dishwasher is that, like most surface arguments, it's not about the dishwasher, right? It is about the context of the relationship and how people are feeling in general about each other and the relationship. Are people feeling safe? Are they feeling loved? Are they feeling connected? Are they feeling intimate? Are they feeling like their partner is their partner, like actually their partner in life? If you are not feeling those things, it's going to come out in you're not loading the dishwasher right. You have something to say about everything I do. I can never do anything right. Like, who cares about the dishwasher? But it's really like you're fundamentally not having your needs met in the relationship when you are truly arguing over how to load the dishwasher. Because in a loving, happy, in the beginning, when there's all kinds of new relationship energy, you actually don't care about if someone's loading the dishwasher in a way that you wouldn't do it, because you're full of feelings of love and connection and dopamine and all of this stuff. That, of course, fades over time. That's natural. That's just biology. That's how it works. But if you put yourself in the space of, what would I be doing if I was feeling really loved and connected? And then you do that thing, as in, don't criticize how my partner is loading the dishwasher, then they will also feel like they're not being criticized. And they will also be sort of giving generously, in spirit of like how you feel loved. This love languages is relevant to this conversation. I mean, all of this stuff is relevant. But
Right. So
yeah,
it sounds like in a lot of ways, when people battle over a dishwasher, it's not really about the dishwasher,
it's
or at
not
least
about the
not the
dishwasher.
primary thing.
It is definitely not the primary thing. Yes.
I think that's an important concept, because I think in a lot of ways, the couple stuff seems to sort of, carry over into lots of different areas. And I think people don't always realize all the different areas that some of the stuff in the dynamics carry into. But I think, to, your point, I think you mentioned earlier today about this idea of how, it's helpful for each person to have their own sort of therapist. The idea is that you bring your own stuff to the table in a couple. So addressing your own stuff makes you sort of a better partner.
Definitely. Yes, for sure. Yeah. Yeah. And, this is why my work with people who are going through divorce or have been through divorce is a really important time, because they do want to reflect and understand what happened and why things didn't work out. And they want to, I mean, some people want to, learn more about themselves. And if they're in a place where they can kind of understand that, they can sort of look at themselves and say, okay, I contributed to this, because of course both people contributed to this. What can I do differently, and to understand myself and to have fulfilling relationships moving forward? Everybody brings stuff, yeah, like you said. So if you are open-minded and introspective, with therapy or whatever else gives you perspective, reading books, listening to podcasts, watching movies, if you anything that makes you reflect can help can help you kind of get to know yourself and help you in this sort of process.
No, I think it's definitely good advice, and definitely very important in terms of that idea of self-reflection.
Hmm. Yeah.
And what advice would you give to someone that's, is listening out there that maybe is really struggling in a relationship and is trying to decide what makes sense in terms of next steps? Because I imagine that's sort of a challenge in terms of this idea of, you're in a relationship, maybe, some stuff's really good, some stuff's not, and you're not quite sure where you go with.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it depends on the stage of the relationship, and I think that, couples therapy can be very helpful if, again, both people are open-minded and introspective. On the other hand, if you are in a relationship where there's a lot of struggle and a lot of argument and you're arguing more often than you're not, or you're feeling really on edge all the time, and this is kind of a new relationship, like couples therapy is not always the answer. Sometimes you're just not a right fit. And so individual therapy can help kind of figure out, is this the right fit for you? What are you looking for? What do you want in your life? How those kinds of questions, so individual therapy can help, but couples therapy is not always the answer, even though sometimes people think couples therapy is always the answer. I mean, sometimes it's just not the right relationship. Now, if you are married and you have kids and you have this life and all of these things, then of course it is worth trying, because there are higher stakes. There are higher stakes at that point in your life than, earlier on, if it's newer, if a relationship is newer. So I think it depends on a lot of things, where you are and, kind of these other factors.
I think another piece of it too is also this idea, I imagine, of the expectations. If your expectations for your partner are not very realistic,
Of course.
they probably are not going to sort of meet your needs then.
Totally. Yeah, of course, right? And that's a lot of work that I do too, is just kind of like, yeah, you can change a little bit. You can learn new habits and you can change patterns and you can look at things differently, but generally speaking, there is not an overhaul of personality. And if you are kind of coming into couples therapy thinking like, my partner is the problem, I need this therapist to help change my partner, I really need my partner to see XYZ, and I need this professional to help point out XYZ and why they're wrong about this, right? That's not my job as a couples therapist. That's not how I specifically approach couples therapy. So accepting is hugely powerful, right? This is where, diagnoses are important. Research, reading, understanding is hugely important, and saying, okay, I can accept this and I can accept that things are not perfect all the time. Of course, I'm not going to get everything that I want. I can communicate and, sort of work it out in that way. But yeah, I mean, really knowing the limitations of your partner and seeing the other positives of what they bring is really important too, in terms of just perspective taking. People argue over parenting too. I mean, people have different parenting styles, certainly in this parenting, the ADHD anxious parenting. And so I talk a lot about parenting, and how it's okay to be different. It's okay to parent differently and to really understand kind of the benefits of that, because that a lot of arguments come from that. And then kids are seeing different parenting styles, but then they're seeing arguing over that. And so we can remove that second piece of it. It's okay to have different parenting styles.
And what would you recommend to people that are in that situation where they're different parenting styles, but different parenting styles contradict each other and create its own set of issues in the actual act of the parent?
Yeah, I mean, this is also, this is very common, again, especially with anxiety and with ADHD. And I just really encourage people to, I help people with perspectives on what are the benefits of the other approach. And there are, right? There always are. You just have to look at it a little bit differently. And it's hard to do that when you're kind of stuck in your own mind of, this is the way to do things. And oftentimes, the anxious person just needs to leave. I mean, just just needs to not say, just needs to stop doing the thing that they're doing. And then the person who they think won't step up actually will. Because ultimately, if you are, in a relationship where you chose your spouse, your partner as a co-parent, you did that for a reason. They might not do it in the same way, but they will do it and it will be fine. But like, people with anxiety don't have a really hard time understanding that, this has to be a certain outfit, or the nap at a certain time, food at a certain time, otherwise like there'll be a catastrophe. But if they're away on business, or if God forbid something happens to them, or if there's a divorce, like the other parent is still parenting and it's fine. And you can really learn to appreciate that aspect of parenting. So I often do that sort of thought experiment. Like, what if you just were not around? What would happen? And the people who would say, well, I wouldn't trust my partner, then there's major issues there. I mean, that's, if that's really how they feel, then that's the bigger fish to fry, right?
Right.
But generally, if people come to couples therapy before that happens, then there's a lot to work with there.
And are there any exercises that you feel like people could do at home? Sort of as a starting point to sort of either make things better or identifying potential issues to work on themselves, or to even bring to couples therapy. And what do you think any suggestion of what people could do at home as a starting point if they want to improve their
Yeah.
parenting?
Yeah. I mean, I think if this resonates, I mean, honestly, I suggest like reading a bit about, how this pair can, just more about this interaction, right? Reading about ADHD, reading about anxiety, just doing your own kind of research about it. I mean, it's like you can't self-diagnose, but you can kind of look and say, yes, 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 these symptoms apply to me.
Yeah.
People can kind of, figure and sort of think about that on their own. And if it really resonates, then like see a professional, but also the person with anxiety, if this feels accurate, if you are somebody who feels like, well, I'm not anxious, I just prefer these things this way, then I encourage you to think about this might be anxiety and like what would happen if things didn't go that way. And, a lot of it is like kind of like exposure therapy, in a sense of what I do with couples is like take a step back, understand the feelings of anxiety, sit with it, like learn that it's okay, it's not going to kill you, it will go away, it will dissipate, and yeah, and then it can be really powerful.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think it's this idea of opening up the communication to start is
Yes,
really important. That seems to be
for
sort of the
sure.
overarching theme of this.
Yeah, and people get very I get judgmental of themselves and of each other, and I just, so much of my work is removing that shame and judgment, and so much of this comes from childhood. Of course, if you're diagnosed later in life with ADHD, then probably in childhood you were told that you were bad or wrong or doing something incorrectly a lot of the time. And so there's a lot of shame. So you just are already coming into an adult relationship with shame that you might not even know that you have. And that's really powerful, of course. So, just education about how brains are different and it's not bad or good. It's just different. And, you just operate different operating systems, And there's an emotional component to it too, right? Rejection sensitivity, emotional sensitivity, things like that, that are not always apparent and are not always a result of ADHD, but often are. And this, of course, can show up too in terms of defensiveness and things like that.
No, absolutely. So yeah, and I guess are there things that we have not talked about today that you feel like are really important for our listeners to know about regarding anxious couples with ADHD?
I think another thing that, I see a lot of is if their kids are diagnosed early, with ADHD or they're having problems in school and so they get evaluated, this often can bring up this is sometimes it brings parents in, right? Like my kid was diagnosed, I think I might also have ADHD, as we know is heritable. So, seeing what your kid is sort of struggling with can be very triggering for you and can also affect your parenting. And so sometimes, if your kid is acting a certain way that you also feel like you're working on, right? If your kid is getting dysregulated or defensive and this is something that you have been working on even subconsciously, then you might react differently to your kid than if you have an understanding of your own mind and you have an understanding of it yourself. You can approach the situation differently and, parent differently and maybe with some more compassion like for yourself and for your kid. Also talk about it with your partner, of course, right? But like we were saying before, a lot of friction can come from different parenting styles, but a lot of it is sort of unrecognized, undiagnosed, ADHD that can be showing up in lots of different ways.
Right, so it sounds like kind of a big takeaway is the idea that if you can take care of yourself and address your own sort of challenges, things that sort of make things a little harder, it helps you to be a more effective partner and parent.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. So and make things easier too, I mean, as you know, I'm sure, right? I mean, from what you do in your work, I mean, the ADHD brain is that can be very magical, It just works differently and it doesn't mean you're stupid, or lazy. This is another big stereotype, and so the more you kind of know about yourself and the more you can have confidence to approach things differently. The confidence piece is really key.
Well, exactly. I think it's definitely a good final thought with that. And if people want to reach out to you, where can they find you?
You can find me on my website, dralanahoffman.com. You can find me on Instagram where I post things about this kind of thing or, all things relationship. That's dr.alana.hoffman. And I have a podcast called Talk Relationship to Me where I talk about all things relationships. And so, yeah, you can find me all those places.
Okay, great. And I'll make sure all that gets into the show notes so people can find you, from the show notes as well with all those.
Amazing. Thank you.
So, and for those of you listening out there, if you like this episode, definitely subscribe to the podcast, and share with a friend who might benefit. And thank you very much for coming on to the podcast today. It was great chatting. I hope this was helpful to all of you out there listening.
Yeah, this was great. Thank you so much for having me.
You're very welcome.